The Curse of Silence. November 1918, the last artillery shells on the Western Front fell silent, leaving behind a ruined Europe and a chilling, eerie quiet. The world breathed a sigh of relief and raised their glasses to celebrate peace. But for Douglas MacArthur, peace was no reward, it was a suffocating glass cage. What does a god of war, born from the mud, nourished by the screams of the charge and the burn of mustard gas, do when there are no more enemies to destroy? When the highest medals of valor were already crowded upon his chest. MacArthur realized a razor-sharp truth: if there were no wars left to conquer, he would have to forge an empire of his own right in the middle of peacetime. The next 3 decades lacked the smoke of artillery, but they constituted the most brutal psychological war imaginable. It was a war where MacArthur weaponized his supreme arrogance to crush every obstacle in his path, from aging generals to the most powerful president in the world, before personally crowning himself with a title unprecedented in human history. The storm that cleansed the tomb of West Point, 1919-1922. Autumn 1919, the gray stone walls of the United States Military Academy at West Point were shrouded in a cold fog rolling off the Hudson River. At the age of 39, Brigadier General Douglas MacArthur strode through the massive iron gates, not as an alumni returning for a visit, but as the youngest superintendent in American history. At the time, West Point resembled a forgotten museum rather than a forge for generals. Walking its stone corridors, MacArthur could smell the musty scent of the past. Aging military professors, their chests adorned with Civil War medals, were still enthusiastically teaching cadets how to form perfect infantry lines and how to execute cavalry charges with sabers. Worse yet, they turned a blind eye to the brutal traditions of hazing, viewing the bloody, midnight beatings of freshmen as a sacred method to forge a man's character. MacArthur, who had just witnessed tens of thousands of young men cut in half by Maxim guns and crushed beneath tanks in the French trenches, felt a boiling disgust. Driven by an uncompromising, dictatorial will, he decided to unleash a storm upon this tomb. He summoned the entire faculty to the Grand Hall. With a voice that was deep yet possessed absolute lethal authority, MacArthur announced the total eradication of the archaic curriculum. The pure killing machine died with the 19th century, he roared. Slamming his fist onto the podium, his piercing eyes sweeping over the wrinkled faces twisting in anger. An officer in the next war cannot just be a butcher who knows how to hold a rifle. He must know how to administer a devastated city. He must understand how the enemy's ruined economy functions. And he must know how to manipulate the psychology of an occupied nation. He ruthlessly expelled cadets and officers who participated in violent hazing. For the first time in the Academy's history, MacArthur forced military cadets to put down their rifles and pick up books on economics, political science, psychology, and sociology. He demanded that every morning, cadets read international newspapers to understand how the outside world was turning. Conservative militarists were driven into a frenzy of outrage. They wrote letters of complaint to the War Department, branding him a defiler of Washington's legacy. But MacArthur ignored them all. His magnificent dictatorship saved West Point from decay. The very cadets he forced to learn global strategic thinking back then became, 20 years later, the brilliant generals who commanded the American war machine to crush the Axis powers in World War II. The Lone Guardian and the Curse at the White House, 1930-1935. A single school quickly became too small for MacArthur's ego. In 1930, at the age of 50, he ascended to the absolute pinnacle of his military career, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, wearing 4 brilliant general stars upon his shoulders. But the throne he inherited was placed in the center of a dying America. The Great Depression had ravaged the country. Millions were homeless, banks had collapsed, and citizens stood in endless breadlines. In a state of desperation, the U.S. Congress decided to use the military as a scapegoat, demanding defense budgets be slashed to the most pitiful levels in history. The army withered to a mere few tens of thousands of men. American soldiers were ragged, lacked live ammunition for training, and were forced to drill on the fields using wooden rifles carved from tree branches. Amidst this tragic backdrop, MacArthur emerged as a grotesque yet magnificent contrast. He refused poverty. He wore custom-tailored uniforms made from the most expensive European fabrics, donned his stylishly crushed cap, kept his signature corncob pipe clamped in his jaw, and walked with the posture of a king. MacArthur transformed himself into the sole guardian of the temple, using his colossal ego as a shield to protect the army from being butchered by politicians. The climax of this arrogance was an earth-shattering confrontation with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, right inside the Oval Office. That day, FDR summoned MacArthur to inform him of even deeper cuts to the military budget. Roosevelt, wearing the calm smile of a seasoned politician, hinted that the public supported him and that the military must learn to sacrifice. Hearing those words, MacArthur's blood boiled. He forgot he was standing before his commander-in-chief. He forgot every rule of military discipline. MacArthur strode right up to the Resolute desk, leaned over, and pointed his finger directly into Roosevelt's face. Through a constricted throat, he spat out the most insolent and venomous words a general had ever dared to speak to an American president. "Listen to me. When we lose the next bloody war, and an American boy is lying in the black mud with an enemy bayonet plunged deep into his belly, I want the last breath he draws to be used to curse your name. Not mine." The air in the Oval Office turned to ice. Secretary of War George Dern, sitting nearby, turned deathly pale. Roosevelt was stunned, the smile vanishing from his lips, his eyes flashing with extreme fury. Realizing he had just crossed a point of no return, MacArthur angrily turned on his heel and took long strides out the door, entirely ignoring the president shouting for him to come back. As soon as he stepped out the doors of the White House and descended the stone steps, the massive spike of adrenaline in his blood suddenly crashed, causing his stomach to violently spasm. Overcome with extreme agitation, fury, and stress, the four-star general collapsed and vomited violently right on the steps of the executive mansion. That confrontation nearly got MacArthur fired for insubordination, but his extreme madness created an undeniable psychological shockwave. Roosevelt was forced to back down, and a portion of the core budget was preserved. The United States Army barely survived its darkest years, all because they were protected by a man who dared to challenge the most powerful man in the world. The velvet throne of the Field Marshal of the Orient, 1935-1937. By 1935, the air in Washington, D.C. had become far too suffocating. MacArthur realized that as long as Roosevelt sat in the White House, he would always be a subordinate. His ego hungered for a private kingdom, a place where his word was absolute law, and his presence worshipped as a messiah. A golden opportunity presented itself when Manuel Quezon, president of the Commonwealth of the Philippines, invited MacArthur to Manila to serve as the supreme military advisor. The Philippines was on a roadmap to independence and desperately needed to build a self-defense force from scratch. MacArthur agreed instantly. He packed his bags, left the Pentagon, and brought along his mother, trunks of expensive clothing, and a quiet, diligent aide-de-camp named Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would later become U.S. President and MacArthur's own superior. In Manila, MacArthur was no longer a hired general. President Quezon treated him like a true Oriental viceroy. MacArthur was granted the entire top floor, the most luxurious penthouse of the Manila Hotel. The suite was decorated with solid mahogany, red velvet carpets, massive bookshelves holding thousands of volumes on military strategy, and a sweeping balcony looking straight out over the azure waters of Manila Bay. Here, he lived a regal life, cheered by tens of thousands of Filipinos wherever he went. MacArthur's arrogance reached its absolute zenith in 1937. Feeling that the American four-star rank was no longer commensurate with his superhuman status, MacArthur submitted his resignation from the United States Army. But he did not retire. On the exact day he left the U.S. military, the Philippine government held a grand ceremony, awarding him a military rank that had never existed, custom designed to satisfy his ultimate lust for power, Field Marshal of the Philippine Army. No one in the history of the U.S. military had ever been appointed a Field Marshal. Yet MacArthur claimed it for himself in a foreign nation. To celebrate, he personally designed a brand new uniform. It was a brilliant, form-fitting white uniform. His officer's cap was heavily embroidered with oak leaves made of pure gold thread. Heavy and glittering under the tropical sun, during military parades, he held a solid gold Field Marshal baton, standing on the grandstand watching tens of thousands of Philippine soldiers present arms to him. Standing on the windy balcony of the Manila Hotel, taking long drags from his pipe, MacArthur looked out over the vast ocean. He firmly believed that with his genius mind, he would turn this island nation into an impregnable steel fortress. He had achieved the ultimate, perfect peak of his career, he had become the uncrowned king of Asia. But history has a uniquely cruel way of punishing those who dare to consider themselves gods. The radiant field marshal in his white uniform, drowning in illusions of power, failed to notice the silent shift in the sea breeze. Beyond the distant horizon of the Pacific, the Japanese Empire was quietly building massive aircraft carriers and sharpening its katana swords. Just 4 years later, a storm of fire named Pearl Harbor would rain down from the sky, tearing apart the velvet and silk of this illusory kingdom, and plunging the proud field marshal into the deepest abyss of humiliation, death, and blood-soaked vows.